Thomas Rivera stood at his kitchen window, watching the snow fall in thick, heavy flakes that blanketed everything in sight. At 67 years old, he'd seen plenty of Montana winters, but this one felt different. Colder somehow. Emptier. 2 years had passed since Maria died, and the silence in the house still caught him off guard. He'd catch himself setting 2 coffee cups on the counter in the morning, or turning to tell her something funny he'd heard on the radio, only to remember she wasn't there. The grief had settled into something duller now, but it never really left. It just changed shape. Bear, his German shepherd, nudged Thomas's hand with his wet nose. The dog had been Maria's idea, adopted from the shelter 3 years ago. Back then, Bear had been a scraggly, nervous thing that wouldn't look anyone in the eye. Now he was Thomas's constant companion, following him from room to room like a furry shadow. "You need to go out, boy?" Thomas asked, scratching behind Bear's ears. The dog's tail wagged, and Thomas grabbed his heavy coat from the hook by the door. Outside, the world was pure white and perfectly still. Thomas's property stretched for 12 acres, mostly woods and open fields that bumped up against state forest land. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles down the road. The nearest town, Pine Ridge, was 15 miles away. In summer, Thomas didn't mind the isolation. In winter, it pressed down on him like the gray sky overhead. He ran a small woodworking business from his barn, crafting custom furniture and cabinets. It kept him busy and brought in enough money to get by. People from town would call with orders, and once a month he'd drive in to deliver finished pieces and pick up supplies. That monthly trip was usually the only time he saw other people face to face. The woodworking helped pass the time, but it didn't fill the quiet. Maria had been a talker, always humming while she cooked or reading him interesting bits from the newspaper. Without her, the house felt like a museum. Beautiful, maybe, but empty of life. It was during one of his monthly supply runs in early December that Thomas noticed the flyer on the community bulletin board at the Pine Ridge Library. He'd stopped in to warm up and use the bathroom before heading home. The bright yellow paper caught his eye. "Seeking connection this winter?" It read in cheerful letters. "Join our community pen pal program. Share stories, make friends, and brighten someone's day through the art of letter writing. All ages welcome, no obligation to meet in person." Thomas stood there for a long moment, reading it over twice. Letter writing. He hadn't written a real letter since his Army days decades ago. These days, everything was emails and text messages, though he barely used those either. But something about the idea appealed to him. Letters were solid, real. You could hold them in your hands. Before he could talk himself out of it, Thomas tore off one of the small tabs at the bottom of the flyer with the program coordinator's phone number. He stuffed it in his coat pocket and headed home. That evening, after feeding Bear and heating up a can of soup for dinner, Thomas pulled out the crumpled paper and stared at the number. This was foolish, he thought. What would he even write about? Who would want to read letters from a lonely old man? But then he thought about the long winter ahead, the short days and long nights, the silence that seemed to grow thicker as the snow piled up outside. He picked up the phone and dialed before he could change his mind. The coordinator, a friendly woman named Helen who ran the program through the library, sounded delighted to hear from him. She explained that they matched people based on general interests and preferences. "Did he have any requests?" "Someone who doesn't mind if I'm not much of a writer," Thomas said. "And maybe someone who doesn't expect to meet up. I live pretty far out." "That's perfectly fine," Helen assured him. "We have several participants who prefer to keep things to letters only. Let me see who might be a good match." 3 days later, Thomas received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a welcome packet and a letter from his assigned pen pal. The handwriting was neat and careful, slightly slanted to the right. "Dear Thomas," it began, "my name is E.M., and I'm glad we've been matched for this program. I live in the county next to yours, and like you, I prefer to keep our friendship to letters if that's all right. I think there's something special about written words. They feel more thoughtful somehow. Like each sentence matters more when you have to put pen to paper." The letter went on for 2 pages. E.M. wrote about loving nature and the outdoors, about missing long walks and the smell of pine trees. There was a sadness woven through the words, though E.M. tried to keep things light. She asked Thomas questions about his life, what he did for work, whether he had any pets. Thomas read the letter 3 times that first night. Then he sat down at his kitchen table with a pad of plain paper and a pen Maria had given him for his birthday years ago. His hand felt stiff and awkward at first, the words coming slowly. "Dear E.M.," he wrote. "Thank you for your letter. It was nice to find it in my mailbox today. I live alone except for my dog Bear. He's a German shepherd and pretty much my best friend these days. I run a woodworking shop from my barn. I make furniture, mostly tables and cabinets. It's quiet work, which suits me." He told her about Maria, how she'd died 2 years ago from cancer. He wasn't sure if that was too heavy for a first letter, but E.M. had been honest about her own sadness, so he figured he could be honest too. He wrote about missing having someone to talk to, about how the winters felt longer now. When he finished, it was after midnight. Thomas read over what he'd written, feeling self-conscious about his simple words and plain sentences. But he sealed it in an envelope anyway and drove into town the next morning to mail it from the post office. E.M.'s reply came 5 days later. Her words were warm and understanding. She told him she'd lost her husband many years ago and knew something about that particular kind of loneliness. She said she was sorry about Maria and that it was clear Thomas had loved her very much. That simple acknowledgement made Thomas's throat tight as he read it. They settled into a rhythm. Thomas would write once a week, usually on Sunday evenings after dinner. E.M. wrote back just as regularly. At first, their letters were careful and polite, like two people getting to know each other at a distance. But as December turned to January, something shifted. E.M. began to open up more. She wrote about feeling trapped by circumstances she didn't quite explain. She mentioned having an adult child who lived with her, and that things at home were complicated. She never gave specific details, but Thomas could read between the lines. There was fear there, hidden beneath her careful words. Thomas found himself checking the mailbox every day, even when he knew it was too soon for a reply. On the days when E.M.'s letters arrived, the whole day felt brighter somehow. He'd saved the envelope, carrying it in his pocket until evening when he could sit down and read it properly with a cup of coffee. He wrote to her about his work, describing the grain patterns in different woods and how satisfying it felt to smooth rough lumber into something beautiful. He told her about Bear's funny habits, like how the dog insisted on stealing socks from the laundry basket. He shared memories of Maria, stories he hadn't told anyone in years. E.M. wrote back about books she loved, old movies she wished she could watch again, recipes she used to cook. She wrote about missing the freedom to just walk outside whenever she wanted, to breathe fresh air without anyone questioning where she was going. Those comments worried Thomas, but when he gently asked if she was okay, she'd changed the subject in her next letter. By mid-January, they were writing twice a week, sometimes more. E.M.'s letters became something Thomas looked forward to with an intensity that surprised him. It wasn't romantic, not exactly. It was more like finding a friend who understood, someone who knew what it meant to feel invisible, forgotten by a world that had moved on without you. She sent him a photograph once, tucked into a letter. It showed a garden in full summer bloom, flowers everywhere in bright colors. "This was mine years ago," she'd written on the back. "I hope to have another someday." The handwriting was the same careful script, but Thomas noticed her hand must have been shaking slightly when she wrote it. The letters wavered just a bit. Thomas sent her a photo too. One of Bear sleeping in a patch of sunlight on the workshop floor. Sawdust all around him. E.M. wrote back that the image made her smile for the first time in weeks. As February arrived, Thomas realized he'd come to depend on these letters more than he'd intended. They'd become a lifeline, pulling him through the darkest part of winter. He found himself thinking about E.M. during the day, wondering what she was doing, hoping she was safe. Then in late February, E.M.'s final letter arrived. Thomas knew something was wrong the moment he opened it. The handwriting was different, shakier than usual. Some words were crossed out and rewritten. The whole thing felt rushed, almost frantic. "Dear Thomas," it began, "I want you to know how much your letters have meant to me these past months. You reminded me that kindness still exists in this world, that even in the darkest times, human connection matters. You've been a true friend, and I'll always be grateful for that. Please don't worry about me. Sometimes life takes us in directions we don't expect, and we have to find the courage to accept what comes. Thank you for everything. Your friend always, E.M." Thomas read it over and over, his hands trembling. This was a goodbye. But why? What had happened? The letter felt wrong, like E.M. was trying to tell him something without actually saying it. He sat down immediately and wrote back, his words urgent and worried. Was she all right? Had something happened? Please write back and let him know she was safe. He mailed it that same day, driving through a snowstorm to get to the post office in town. Days passed, then a week, then 2 weeks. No response came. Thomas tried calling Helen at the library, but she explained that the program protected participants' privacy. She couldn't give him EM's full name or address without permission. She promised to try reaching out through the program's channels, but her tone suggested she wasn't optimistic. March arrived, and still nothing. Thomas wrote 2 more letters, each one more desperate than the last. Had he said something wrong? Was EM angry with him? Or was something worse going on? He couldn't shake the feeling that his friend was in trouble. Those hints in her letters about feeling trapped, about not being free to come and go, about her difficult home situation, and that final letter with its shaky handwriting and cryptic goodbye, none of it sat right with him. But what could he do? He didn't even know EM's full name or where exactly she lived. Just somewhere in the next county over, which covered hundreds of square miles. Winter finally began to loosen its grip as April approached. The snow started melting, revealing the dead grass and mud underneath. Thomas went through the motions of his days, working in his shop, taking care of Bear, eating meals he barely tasted. But his mind kept circling back to those unanswered letters, to the friend he'd somehow lost without ever having met. He kept EM's letters in a wooden box on his bedside table. Sometimes at night he'd take them out and read through them again, trying to find clues he might have missed, trying to understand what had gone wrong. Bear seemed to sense his distress. The dog stuck even closer than usual, resting his head on Thomas's knee while he sat at the kitchen table, or lying across his feet while he worked in the shop. Animals knew, Thomas thought. They understood sadness in a way that didn't need words. As the snow melted and the first hints of spring appeared, Thomas tried to accept that he might never know what happened to EM. Maybe she'd simply decided to end their correspondence. Maybe she'd moved away or gotten busy or just changed her mind about wanting a pen pal. These things happened, but deep in his gut, Thomas knew better. Something was wrong. He could feel it. He just had no idea how soon he'd find out exactly how right he was. The first real day of spring came in early April, warm enough that Thomas could work in his barn with the doors open. The smell of fresh-cut wood mixed with the scent of thawing earth, and for the first time in months he felt something close to peace. Not happiness exactly, but at least the heavy weight on his chest had lightened a bit. He'd stopped checking the mailbox quite so obsessively. 3 weeks had passed since his last unanswered letter to EM, and Thomas was trying to accept what seemed obvious. For whatever reason, his pen pal had decided to move on. It hurt, but life was full of small hurts. You learned to carry them. Bear had other ideas about moving on, though. That morning, during their usual walk around the property, the dog started acting strange. They'd been following the same route they always did, a wide loop through the woods that circled back to the house. But when they got near the back fence line, where Thomas's land bumped up against the state forest land, Bear stopped dead in his tracks. The dog's ears went up, pointing forward like radar dishes. His whole body went stiff, nose working the air. Then he took off running toward a section of woods Thomas rarely visited. It was too overgrown back there, full of fallen logs and thick brush that made walking difficult. "Bear, come back here," Thomas called, but the dog ignored him completely. That wasn't like Bear at all. He was a well-trained dog, always obedient. Something had him spooked or excited. Thomas couldn't tell which. Thomas pushed through the undergrowth, branches catching at his jacket. He could hear Bear up ahead, barking in that urgent way that meant he'd found something important. Please don't let it be a skunk, Thomas thought. Or worse, a porcupine. He'd had to pull quills out of Bear once before, and neither of them wanted to repeat that experience. But when Thomas finally caught up to the dog, he found something much stranger than wildlife. Bear was digging frantically at a patch of disturbed earth, partially hidden beneath fallen branches and a thick carpet of old, wet leaves. Someone had tried to cover this spot, Thomas realized, tried to make it look natural, but the ground was different here, looser and darker than the surrounding soil. "Bear, stop that. Get back," Thomas said firmly, grabbing the dog's collar. Something about this felt wrong. Very wrong. Thomas knelt down, his knees protesting. He pushed aside some of the branches and leaves with his hands. The earth underneath had definitely been dug up and then filled in again. Recently, too, probably sometime during the winter when the ground had been soft enough to work. Then he saw it. A scrap of purple fabric poking through the dirt. His heart started hammering in his chest. With shaking hands, Thomas cleared away more of the loose soil. More fabric appeared. It looked like a scarf or maybe part of a jacket. Thomas stood up so fast he got dizzy. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket with trembling fingers and dialed 911. The reception out here was terrible, but he got through after 2 tries. 1. What's your emergency? My name is Thomas Rivera. I'm at 4782 County Road 19. I think I found a body on my property. The words felt unreal coming out of his mouth like he was in some TV crime show instead of standing in his own woods on a sunny spring morning. But there was no mistaking what he'd found. Someone had buried something here. Someone had buried someone. The dispatcher kept him on the line, asking questions he could barely focus on answering. Yes, he was sure. No, he hadn't touched anything besides moving some branches. Yes, he was alone except for his dog. No, he didn't feel unsafe. Sheriff's deputies arrived in about 40 minutes, which was fast considering how far out Thomas lived. 2 squad cars came bouncing up his long driveway, followed shortly by an unmarked sedan. Thomas met them at the house and led them back through the woods, Bear trotting alongside on his leash. The deputies took over from there, securing the area with yellow tape and calling for additional support. More vehicles arrived, people in uniforms and others in regular clothes carrying equipment. Thomas stood off to the side holding Bear's leash with numb fingers, watching this invasion of his quiet property. A woman in jeans and a dark blue jacket approached him. She had black hair pulled back in a ponytail and tired eyes that had probably seen too much. Mr. Rivera? I'm Detective Chen with the County Sheriff's Department. I need to ask you some questions. Thomas nodded, his throat too dry to speak. Detective Chen led him away from the site, back toward his house where they could talk without being in the way. She was professional but not unkind, and she didn't treat him like a suspect, which Thomas appreciated. They sat at his kitchen table while Bear lay at Thomas's feet. Tell me what happened this morning, Detective Chen said, pulling out a notebook. Thomas explained about the walk, about Bear's behavior, about finding the disturbed earth. His words came out choppy and disjointed, but Chen was patient, letting him take his time. When he finished, she asked how often he walked back in that area. Almost never, Thomas admitted. It's too overgrown. I stick to the clearer paths mostly. I probably haven't been back that far since last fall. And you haven't noticed anyone on your property? No strange vehicles or people around? No, ma'am. I'm pretty isolated out here. I don't get visitors. They talked for another 20 minutes. Chen asked about his neighbors, about whether he'd heard or seen anything unusual during the winter months. Thomas racked his brain but came up with nothing helpful. His nearest neighbor was old Mrs. Patterson, 3 miles down the road, and he only saw her once in a blue moon. Finally, Chen stood up. We're going to be here for a while, processing the scene. I'll need you to stay available in case we have more questions. Don't leave the county without letting us know. Thomas spent the rest of the day in a daze, watching from his kitchen window as official vehicles came and went. Late in the afternoon, he saw them bring out a stretcher with a black bag on it. His stomach turned and he had to look away. Around 5 o'clock, Detective Chen knocked on his door again. Her expression was grave. We've made a preliminary identification, she said. The victim is a woman named Eleanor Morrison. Does that name mean anything to you? Eleanor Morrison, E.M., the room tilted. Thomas grabbed the door frame to steady himself. Oh, God, he whispered. Oh, God, no. Chen's eyes sharpened. You know her? We wrote letters. She was my pen pal, Eleanor Morrison. E.M., we've been writing since December. The words tumbled out of Thomas now, everything spilling forth. The pen pal program. The letters. Eleanor's hints about trouble at home. That final strange goodbye letter in February. The weeks of silence. I need to see those letters, Chen said quietly. Thomas brought her the wooden box from his bedside table. His hand shook as he handed it over. Chen opened it carefully as if it held something precious and fragile, which it did, Thomas thought. It held Eleanor's words, her thoughts, her life captured in ink on paper. Chen read through several letters right there, her face growing more serious with each one. She talks about feeling trapped, she said. About someone at home making things difficult. Did she ever tell you who? Her son, Thomas said, the memory coming back to him now. She mentioned once that her adult son lived with her, that things were complicated. but she never gave details. I asked once if she was okay, and she just changed the subject. Did you ever meet her in person? No. Never. That was the whole point of the program for both of us. We just wanted someone to write to, someone to talk to without any pressure. Thomas felt tears burning behind his eyes. I should have pushed harder. I should have insisted on meeting her, on making sure she was safe. This isn't your fault, Chen said firmly. But these letters might help us figure out what happened to her. I'm going to need to take them as evidence. Thomas could only nod. He watched as Chen carefully placed each letter back in the box, handling them like the precious artifacts they were. Evidence now. Proof that Eleanor Morrison had existed, had thought and felt and hoped and feared. When did she die? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We won't know for certain until after the autopsy, but based on what we can tell so far, probably sometime in late February, maybe early March, right around when that last letter arrived. The one that felt so wrong, so rushed and frightened. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling sick. While he'd been sitting in his warm house, worried but ultimately doing nothing, Eleanor had been lying dead in the cold ground not a quarter-mile away. After Chen left with the letters, Thomas sat alone in the growing darkness. He couldn't bring himself to turn on the lights. Bear pressed against his leg, offering the only comfort the dog knew how to give. Thomas thought about Eleanor's letters, about all the things she'd written, how she loved gardens and old movies and chocolate chip cookies, how she'd been a teacher for 30 years before retiring, how she'd once driven across the country by herself just to see the ocean, how she'd written to him that his letters made her feel less alone in the world, and now she was gone. Dead and buried like garbage on his property, hidden away as if she'd never mattered at all. But she had mattered. To Thomas, she'd mattered very much. Over the next few days, more details emerged. Detective Chen came back twice with more questions. She told Thomas that Eleanor had been reported missing by a concerned neighbor about 6 weeks ago. The neighbor, a woman named Priya Kapoor, had gotten worried when Eleanor stopped answering her door and the mail started piling up. Eleanor's son David had told the police that his mother had gone to stay with relatives in another state. He'd shown them some text messages supposedly from Eleanor, saying she needed space and time away. The police had done a basic check, but found no reason to suspect foul play. People left home all the time. Adults had that right, except Eleanor hadn't left. She'd been dead in Thomas's woods the whole time. We're looking closely at the son, Chen told Thomas during her second visit. David Morrison. He's our primary person of interest. Why would he? Thomas couldn't finish the question. Why would anyone hurt their own mother? What kind of person did something like that? We're still piecing it together, Chen said carefully. But it looks like there might have been a dispute over money. Eleanor had recently inherited a sum from her sister who passed away. About $85,000. David felt entitled to it, but Eleanor had other plans. Thomas remembered Eleanor mentioning in one of her letters that she hoped to move to a senior living community someday, a place where she could have her own space but still have people around. She'd written about it wistfully, like it was a distant dream. Now Thomas understood. She'd been planning to use that inheritance money to escape, to finally be free of whatever situation had made her feel so trapped. She'd almost made it. Just a few more weeks or months and she might have gotten out. The autopsy results came back. Eleanor had died from blunt force trauma to the head. It was consistent with a fall, Chen said, or with being struck with something. Given the circumstances and location of the body, this wasn't being ruled an accident. Thomas learned all this in pieces, through brief conversations with Detective Chen, and through news reports that started appearing on local TV and in the newspaper. Body found on rural property. Local woman's death investigated. The stories were short and factual, missing everything that mattered. They didn't mention Eleanor's love of gardens or her careful handwriting. They didn't talk about how she'd reached out across the winter darkness to find a friend. A week after the discovery, Chen called Thomas. We arrested David Morrison this morning, she said. Charged him with second-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. I thought you'd want to know. Thomas thanked her and hung up. He should have felt relief or satisfaction or something, but all he felt was empty and tired. That evening, he took Bear for a walk, deliberately avoiding the back section of woods where the yellow police tape still fluttered in the breeze. They stuck to the familiar paths, the safe routes. Bear walked close to Thomas's side, as if understanding that his human needed extra support right now. The sun was setting when they got back to the house, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that were almost painful in their beauty. Thomas stood in his driveway watching the colors fade and thought about Eleanor Morrison. She'd wanted someone to write to. Someone who would listen without judgment, who would care about her words. And for a few short months, Thomas had been that person. It wasn't enough to save her. Not nearly enough. But maybe it had meant something. Maybe in those final weeks of her life, his letters had brought her a small measure of comfort and joy. He hoped so. It was the only thought that made any of this bearable. Inside, Thomas made dinner without really tasting it. He kept thinking about that wooden box now sitting in some evidence room full of Eleanor's careful words. He wondered if he'd ever get those letters back, or if they'd be locked away forever as part of a criminal case. Before bed, Thomas sat down and wrote something he hadn't written in weeks. A letter. But this one wouldn't be mailed anywhere. It would stay with him. "Dear Eleanor," he wrote, "I'm so sorry I couldn't help you when you needed it. I'm sorry your son took you from this world before you got the chance to have that garden again, or to live in that quiet place you dreamed about. But I want you to know that you mattered. Your letters mattered. You made my winter less lonely, and you reminded me what it felt like to have a friend. I won't forget you. I promise." He signed it and folded it carefully, placing it in his desk drawer. Then Thomas turned off the lights and went to bed, with Bear curled up on the floor beside him, and tried not to think about the woman who'd been buried in his woods all winter while he'd sat in his warm house, wondering why she'd stopped writing back. Detective Chen became a regular visitor to Thomas's house over the following weeks. She'd stop by with updates, sometimes with more questions, and Thomas appreciated that she kept him in the loop. Most detectives probably wouldn't bother, he thought. But Chen seemed to understand that he needed to know that Eleanor had been his friend, even if they'd never met face to face. "We've been digging into David Morrison's background," Chen told him one afternoon, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee Thomas had made. "And the picture isn't pretty." David was 34 years old, Chen explained. He'd moved back in with Eleanor 3 years ago after a messy divorce left him broke and bitter. He'd been through a string of jobs since then, getting fired from most of them for showing up late or not showing up at all. Eleanor had been supporting him, paying for everything while David drank and played video games most days. "Neighbors say they heard arguments," Chen continued. "Loud ones, especially in the months before Eleanor disappeared. Mostly about money. David felt entitled to his mother's income, her house, everything. When Eleanor's sister died and left her that inheritance, David saw it as his ticket out. But Eleanor had other ideas." Thomas listened, his hands wrapped around his own coffee mug. The ceramic was warm against his palms, grounding him. "She wanted to use it to move away," he said quietly. "Exactly. We found paperwork in her bedroom. She'd been looking at senior living communities, the kind where you have your own apartment but there's staff on site and social activities. She'd even put down a deposit at a place called Meadowbrook about 50 miles from here. She was planning to move in May, just a few weeks away now." Eleanor had been so close to freedom. Chen pulled out her notebook, flipping through pages. "We interviewed the neighbor who reported Eleanor missing. Mrs. Kapoor lives 2 houses down. She said Eleanor had confided in her about wanting to leave, about being afraid of how David would react. Mrs. Kapoor encouraged her to go through with it, told her she deserved to be happy." "Did Mrs. Kapoor see anything the night Eleanor died?" Thomas asked. "She saw something but didn't realize what it meant at the time." Chen's expression darkened. "Late one night in February, she was up with insomnia, looking out her window. She saw David loading something heavy into his truck, something wrapped in a tarp. She thought maybe he was finally moving out, taking furniture or something. She didn't think to report it." Thomas felt sick. That had been Eleanor, wrapped up like trash, being hauled away to be buried in the woods, while Mrs. Kapoor watched from her window, having no idea her friend was already dead. "We got a warrant to search David's house," Chen went on. "Eleanor's house, technically, though David's been acting like it belongs to him. We found blood traces in the garage. Eleanor's blood. David had cleaned it up, but he didn't do a very good job. Luminol lit the place up like a Christmas tree. So he killed her in the garage? That's what it looks like. We found some of Eleanor's hair and skin tissue too, caught in the seam where the garage floor meets the wall. The medical examiner says the wound pattern is consistent with Eleanor falling and hitting her head on concrete, or being pushed and hitting her head. Thomas closed his eyes. He could picture it too easily. An argument escalating, David's anger boiling over, a shove. Maybe not even meant to kill, but hard enough to send Eleanor stumbling backward. The sickening crack of her skull hitting the floor. And then David realizing what he'd done, choosing to hide it rather than call for help. "There's more," Chen said. "We found drafts of a letter in David's bedroom. Multiple attempts at copying Eleanor's handwriting. He was trying to forge that last letter she sent you." Thomas's eyes snapped open. "What?" Chen nodded grimly. "We brought in a handwriting expert. That final letter you received? It wasn't written by Eleanor. David wrote it, trying to imitate her style. He'd practiced over and over using her old letters and greeting cards as reference. The expert says he did a decent job, good enough to fool someone who only knew Eleanor's writing from letters. But there are subtle differences. The pressure points, the way certain letters connect. It wasn't her. The room seemed to tilt. Thomas gripped the edge of the table. "He wrote that letter? After he killed her?" "We think so, yes." He mailed it from Eleanor's address using stamps he found in her desk. The postmark date was 3 days after we believe she died. David was trying to create a paper trail, make it look like Eleanor had decided to cut off contact with her pen pal before leaving town. That way, if anyone asked questions, he could say she'd been preparing to go. Thomas thought about that letter, the one that had felt so wrong, the shaky handwriting he'd attributed to Eleanor being upset, the rushed, almost frantic tone. He'd known something was off. He'd felt it in his gut. But he hadn't pushed hard enough, hadn't done anything except write back and wait. "Don't do that to yourself," Chen said, reading his expression. "You couldn't have known." David fooled everyone, including police officers who were trained to spot this kind of thing. He had text messages from Eleanor on his phone, supposedly sent after she disappeared. We had our tech people analyze them. They were sent from David's laptop using a web-based texting service. He created a whole fake trail. "Why did he bury her on my property?" Thomas asked. The question had been eating at him. "Why here?" "We found evidence that David had been following Eleanor's mail, reading her letters. He knew about you, knew where you lived. Your property backs up to state forest land, pretty isolated, hard to access. David researched the area online. We found his search history. He was looking for remote spots where he could dispose of—" Chen paused, then continued carefully. "Where he could hide what he'd done. Your back fence line was perfect, close enough to the road that he could access it, but far enough from your house that you'd probably never find it. Except Bear found it." "Except Bear found it," Chen agreed, with the hint of a sad smile. "Dogs have a way of uncovering things we'd rather keep buried." No pun intended. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, Thomas could hear birds singing, oblivious to human tragedy. Life just kept going regardless of who got left behind. "What happens now?" Thomas asked finally. "Now we build the case for trial. The prosecutor is confident we have enough evidence for a conviction. The blood evidence, the forged letter, David's search history, financial motive, witness statements about the arguments. It's solid. But David's lawyer is already setting up a defense. They're claiming it was an accident. That David and Eleanor argued she fell, he panicked and made bad decisions in the heat of the moment. An accident." Thomas's voice was flat. He accidentally wrote that fake letter. Accidentally researched burial sites. Accidentally wrapped his mother in a tarp and drove her out to the woods in the middle of the night. I know. Believe me, I know. But that's how defense lawyers work, They'll try to get it knocked down to manslaughter, get him a lighter sentence. That's why it's important we have everything documented. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement. Chen leaned forward. "Which brings me to why I'm really here. The trial is going to start in October. I need to know if you're willing to testify." Thomas hadn't expected that. "Testify? About what?" "About the letters. About what Eleanor wrote to you, the things she said about feeling trapped, about being afraid, about how that final letter seemed different, wrong somehow. Your testimony could help establish that Eleanor was planning to leave, that David had motive to stop her. And it could help counter his claim that everything was fine between them. The thought of sitting in a courtroom, talking about Eleanor's private words to a room full of strangers made Thomas's stomach churn. But then he thought about Eleanor herself, about how she'd reached out across the winter darkness looking for a friend, about how she'd deserved so much better than what she got. "I'll do it," Thomas said. "Whatever you need." Chen looked relieved. "Thank you. I'll be in touch as we get closer to the trial date. In the meantime, if you remember anything else from the letters, anything at all that might be relevant, let me know." After she left, Thomas sat alone at his kitchen table for a long time. Bear eventually nudged his hand, reminding him it was past dinner time for both of them. Thomas got up mechanically, feeding the dog and heating up a frozen dinner for himself that he ate without tasting. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about David Morrison, trying to understand what kind of person could kill their own mother and then carefully cover it up. Had there been any moment where David felt remorse, any second where he considered calling an ambulance trying to save her? Or had he simply seen an obstacle removed, a problem solved? Thomas had never considered himself a violent man. He'd been in the army years ago, done his service, but never saw combat. He'd lived a quiet life, married his sweetheart, worked with his hands, hurt no one. But lying there in the darkness, he found himself imagining what he'd like to do to David Morrison. The rage surprised him with its intensity. He got up, unable to lie still anymore, and went to his desk. He pulled out the letter he'd written to Eleanor after she was found, the one he'd never send. He read it over, then took out a fresh piece of paper. This letter was different. This one was to himself, trying to work through the tangle of emotions in his chest. Guilt that he hadn't done more, anger at David Morrison, sadness for Eleanor and the life she should have had, confusion about why any of this had happened at all. Writing had always helped him think, even before the pen pal program. Maria used to tease him about it, finding scraps of paper around the house with his thoughts scrawled across them. "You're a philosopher at heart," she'd say. "Just too shy to share your philosophy with anyone." Maybe she'd been right. Maybe that's why the letters with Eleanor had meant so much. It was a safe way to share thoughts, to connect with another human being without the pressure of face-to-face interaction, without the fear of being judged or rejected in real time. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Spring settled over Montana properly, the world turning green and alive. Thomas tried to return to normal routines. He worked in his shop, completed orders, took Bear on long walks through the parts of his property that didn't make him think of death and betrayal. Detective Chen stopped by a few more times with updates. David Morrison was out on bail, living in Eleanor's house. That fact made Thomas's blood boil, but Chen explained there wasn't much they could do about it. David technically owned half the house, and until he was convicted, he had a right to stay there. The prosecution was building their case methodically. They had expert witnesses lined up, forensic evidence documented, a timeline established. Chen seemed confident, but she warned Thomas that trials could be unpredictable. Juries sometimes made decisions that didn't make sense to the people who'd worked the case. "We're doing everything right," she assured him, "but I can't promise you how it'll turn out. I just want you to be prepared for that." Thomas nodded, appreciating her honesty. He'd seen enough of life to know that justice wasn't guaranteed. Good people suffered while bad people sometimes got away with things. All you could do was try your best and hope it was enough. In late June, Chen called with news. "David's lawyer approached us with a plea deal. He's willing to plead guilty to manslaughter in exchange for a lighter sentence. 15 years, possibility of parole after 10. "What did you say?" Thomas asked. "We turned it down. The prosecutor wants to go to trial, push for the murder conviction. But I wanted you to know the offer was made. Eleanor's family is being consulted too. They'll have final say on whether we accept a plea or go to trial." "She has family? I thought it was just David." "She has a younger sister, Patricia. Lives out in Oregon. She flew in last month to arrange Eleanor's funeral and start dealing with the estate. She's devastated, as you can imagine. I gave her your number, by the way. I hope that's okay. She wanted to talk to you, to the person who was writing to her sister." Thomas's heart skipped. "She called?" "Not yet, but she will. Just be prepared for that." After hanging up, Thomas sat staring at his phone, wondering what he would say to Eleanor's sister. What could he possibly say that would matter? That he'd traded letters with Eleanor for a few months and had been too blind or too passive to realize she was in danger. But when Patricia finally called a week later, her voice on the phone was gentle and kind, with no trace of blame. "Mr. Rivera, this is Patricia Chen, Eleanor's sister. I hope it's okay that I'm calling." "Of course," Thomas managed. "I'm so sorry about your sister." I know," Patricia said quietly. "Detective Chen told me about the letters. About how you tried to reach Eleanor after she stopped writing. You were a good friend to her, Mr. Rivera. That means more than you know. They talked for almost an hour. Patricia told Thomas stories about Eleanor's life, filling in details that the letters had only hinted at. How Eleanor had been a beloved teacher, patient and creative, always going the extra mile for struggling students. How she'd raised David alone after her husband died, working 2 jobs to put food on the table. How she'd always tried to see the best in people, even when they disappointed her. She loved gardens, Patricia said at one point, her voice thick with tears. Did she tell you that in her letters? She did. She sent me a picture of one she'd had years ago. That was at her old house before she had to downsize when she retired. She always said she'd have another garden someday, somewhere she could grow vegetables and flowers and just be at peace. Patricia's voice broke. She almost made it, you know. She was so close to getting out, to starting over. If she'd just had a few more weeks, Thomas felt his own tears coming. I know. I'm so sorry. Before they hung up, Patricia asked if she could come visit Thomas sometime, to see where Eleanor's letters had been going all those months. Thomas said yes without hesitation. Meeting Patricia felt important somehow, like completing a circle that Eleanor had started. As summer deepened and the trial date approached, Thomas found himself thinking about Eleanor constantly. About her careful handwriting and kind words, about the friendship that had blossomed across winter's darkness, bringing light to both their lives. He just hoped that when the trial came, justice would finally be served for the woman who'd only wanted a garden and a friend to write to. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in October. Thomas wore the only suit he owned, the same one he'd worn to Maria's funeral 2 years earlier. It felt tight around the collar, like the fabric was conspiring with his nerves to choke him. Detective Chen had arranged for Thomas to bring Bear into the courthouse as an emotional support animal. The courthouse staff had been skeptical at first, but Chen pulled some strings, citing Bear's role in discovering the crime. So Thomas sat in the back of the courtroom with his dog at his feet, watching as the room filled with people whose lives had been touched by Eleanor's death. Patricia was there, sitting in the front row with an older couple Chen had pointed out as Eleanor's cousins from North Dakota. Mrs. Kapoor, the neighbor, sat a few rows back, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. And then there was David Morrison, sitting at the defense table in a button-down shirt and slacks, looking nothing like a killer. He looked ordinary, almost bored. That was the thing that struck Thomas most. David didn't look evil or monstrous. He looked like someone you'd pass at the grocery store without a second glance. It was terrifying in its ordinariness. The prosecutor was a woman named Jennifer Walsh, mid-40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Thomas had met with her twice before the trial to go over his testimony. She'd been thorough but kind, explaining what to expect and what questions she'd ask. The defense attorney was a man named Robert Caldwell, older and grandfatherly looking, the kind of lawyer who probably wore his folksy charm like a weapon. Thomas had been warned about him. He'll try to make David seem sympathetic, Walsh had said, like a scared kid who made mistakes after a tragic accident. Don't let it rattle you. The first day was mostly jury selection and opening statements. Thomas listened as Walsh laid out the prosecution's case in clear, devastating detail. Eleanor Morrison had been a devoted mother who'd spent years supporting her troubled son. When she finally decided to reclaim her life and move to a place where she could be safe and happy, David had killed her, rather than let her go. Then he'd spent weeks covering up his crime, forging letters, creating fake text messages, lying to everyone who asked about his mother. This wasn't an accident, Walsh said, her voice ringing through the courtroom. This was murder, premeditated, calculated murder, and the defendant went to extraordinary lengths to hide what he'd done, to avoid taking responsibility for taking his own mother's life. Caldwell's opening statement painted a very different picture. Yes, David had made terrible choices after his mother's death. Yes, he'd panicked and done things he shouldn't have, but Eleanor's death itself had been a tragic accident during a heated argument. David had been overcome with fear and shame, making increasingly desperate decisions to avoid the consequences. But he wasn't a murderer. He was a son who'd lost his mother in the worst possible way, and then compounded the tragedy with poor judgment. Ladies and gentlemen, Caldwell said in his warm, grandfatherly voice, this is a case about a family falling apart, about mental health struggles and addiction, and the terrible choices people make when they're drowning. It's a tragedy, yes. But it's not murder. Thomas felt his jaw clench. Eleanor hadn't just fallen apart. She'd been murdered and buried like trash. Calling it anything else was an insult to her memory. The trial stretched across 2 weeks. Thomas attended every day, listening to testimony that painted Eleanor's final months in heartbreaking detail. Mrs. Kapoor testified about the arguments she'd heard, about Eleanor confiding her fears and her plans to move away. She cried on the stand when describing the night she'd seen David loading something into his truck, not realizing she was watching Eleanor being taken away for the last time. The medical examiner testified about Eleanor's injuries, explaining in clinical terms that while the wound could potentially have come from a fall, the force required suggested something more, either a hard push or a blow from an object. The angle was consistent with someone being shoved backward forcefully. Forensic experts walked the jury through the blood evidence found in David's garage, the hair and tissue samples, the luminol patterns that showed significant cleanup efforts. They presented David's internet search history, showing he'd researched how to dispose of bodies, how long it took for evidence to degrade, and remote locations in the county where someone might hide something they didn't want found. The handwriting expert testified about the forged letter, showing the jury enlarged copies of Eleanor's real handwriting compared to the final letter Thomas had received. Even to Thomas's untrained eye, the differences were clear once you knew what to look for. The pressure was different. Certain letters connected in ways Eleanor's never had. It was a good forgery, but it wasn't perfect. David never testified in his own defense. Caldwell kept him off the stand, probably worried he'd crumble under cross-examination. Instead, the defense called character witnesses who testified that David had always loved his mother, that he'd been devoted to her. They brought in a psychologist who talked about David's struggles with depression and alcohol abuse, suggesting these had impaired his judgment after Eleanor's accidental death. On the 8th day of trial, it was Thomas's turn to testify. He'd been dreading this moment, his stomach in knots all morning. When his name was called, he stood on shaky legs, Bear whining softly as Thomas made his way to the witness stand. After being sworn in, Walsh approached with a gentle smile. "Mr. Rivera, how did you come to know Eleanor Morrison?" Thomas explained about the pen pal program, about being lonely after Maria's death and wanting someone to write to. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, too loud in the quiet courtroom. "And you began corresponding with Mrs. Morrison in December of last year?" "Yes, ma'am. Our first letters were early December. We wrote back and forth until late February." Walsh had him describe the frequency of their letters, how they'd grown from once a week to 2 or 3 times a week as winter progressed. She asked about the content of the letters, what Eleanor had shared. She wrote about wanting to have a garden again someday, Thomas said, about missing the freedom to just go outside whenever she wanted. She talked about feeling trapped, like she couldn't make decisions about her own life anymore. "Did she tell you who was making her feel trapped?" "Her son. She said her adult son lived with her and things were difficult. She never gave a lot of details, but you could tell she was scared sometimes.